Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today in War Thunder we're going to be looking at some event vehicles I would like to see in the future. Now yesterday we had a look at the ground forces side of stuff, now it's time to have a look at the air forces. Now I've decided to leave out helicopters because I want to see helicopters more fleshed out first before we start adding event vehicles for them. So in this one we're going to completely, just look at planes, and that really is it. Once again, we're doing a single source idea, so if you want to find more information, the sources will be in the description so you can have a look for yourself. And as per usual, well, as per the second video of the series, we're going to do one vehicle per nation, and I've also decided to throw in some interesting little ones as well as kind of add-ons. So the first one is the XB-42, the Mixmaster attack bomber. Now the XB-42 was a revolutionary design from Edward F. Burton. Now, if you don't know who Edward F. Burton was, he is was the chief of engineering at the Douglas Aircraft Company, and he decided that he wanted to go away from the stereotypical ideas of bomber aircraft, which were just getting bigger and more expensive, and obviously therefore harder for the companies to produce, and the efficiency of the general use was going down because of this. He believed he wanted to change it up. He wanted a new design, and even though there was no actual requirement from the USAAF, he just decided, let's just go ahead, let's create something, and then we'll pitch the idea to them for a role that, maybe they will need. So the ideas that he wanted to run with was the fact that he wanted a fast aircraft which was lighter than the stuff or its contemporaries at the time, which had a lot of power behind it. The idea was that you would have a fast machine, so therefore you don't have to have as much defensive armaments, and it can get to the targets with a large payload, get out of there pretty quickly. So the first thing that you may see from this picture is the fact that it has a contra prop, or a contra-rotating prop in it, basically a dual prop, or however you want to see it. We see this on machines like the VB, that is in-game in the French tech tree, but this is actually on the tail, which I think is definitely an interesting little thing that could be added to it. Now, there were some other American vehicles I had a look at, and I want to thank Rocker for pointing me in the direction of the XB-42 because I'd personally completely forgotten about it. But the ones that I wanted to personally discuss was the YB-40, which is a B-17 kitted out with as many 50 cals as you could, and the idea is at the time that it was created, the Americans were still looking for ideas for trying to keep their bombers alive on these long-range bombing raids that they were doing. So the idea was you would take a YB-40, which was just a B-17 stripped of a lot of stuff, and then just added in more guns, including another dorsal turret that you can see in the picture, and it would go alongside the formations, and this would be like your defensive gunship against enemy fighters. The other one was the P-59 Aerocobra, and for me, I do want to see this in game, but the reason why I didn't talk about this one and instead went for the Douglas is I believe that this should be in the main tech tree, so that's why, we're not going to talk about it today. But anyway, back to this machine. So there were some ideas that were thrown together with this. They wanted, as I said, less people or less crew for the machine, so they limited that to 3, and on top of this, they limited the armament of it because they wanted it to be quick, and on top of this, they still wanted to produce a bomb load of around about 10,000 pounds, which is definitely satisfactory at the time. As you can see from this picture here, we have set up a clear nose, so therefore that would be used, I'm guessing, for the bombardier and also reconnaissance, and the issues that the XB-42 run into were very similar to other contra-rotating prop aircraft did. Overheating was a problem, but not as bad as the VB-10s, which ended up, or at least one of them, just blew up in mid-air after setting fire. But they basically, after creating this design, they decided to build 2 of them. So they made the XB-42, and it had two Allison V1710 engines, which were basically gave it a decent amount of power. They were also they were mounted 20 degrees off the vertical, which is kind of interesting. And as I said, the main issue with these engines was the fact that if you had to push them to emergency power, they would overheat. So the first of the XB42 prototypes produced 1325 horsepower takeoff, 1800 emergency power, and the second prototype had engines which were produced 1675 horsepower and 1900 for war emergency power. So a little bit more in the second prototype. The second prototype also had machine guns. It had 50 calibers in the wings, which were very nice to see, and they've actually got a lovely picture in this article of it, if I can find it. There we go. So these are basically just them out. Obviously they would be locked in, so this means that you can slightly adjust, how the guns are, but the main thing is they'll be locked in. They wouldn't actually look like that when you're flying about. But unfortunately, the second of these prototypes, which was the one which had the slightly better engines and also the actual armament on them, it crashed. After one of its test flights, one of the engines packed in, and to try and keep it stable, at the same time, one of the gear legs gave in. I believe it was the front one, and therefore, because they were having to hammer one of the engines hard to keep this thing in the air, and on top of this, the other engine dying, the pilot decided it was a good idea to bail out and get the hell away. Now, something that is interesting about the XB42, and something that has to, be thought about with these rear propeller planes, is how do you deal with the issue of when you actually bail out of the aircraft? How do you miss the propeller? Because generally, if you bail out of an aircraft, if you don't get far enough away, then you are going to run straight into the propeller blades, which you see right here. So what was done was there was a set of obviously areas of the plane. I believe there was a decent amount in total, maybe 6. I might be a little bit wrong about that. It might be slightly more, but basically they put a cord of explosives, which was cordite. It was threaded through the holes, which were carefully drilled around the gearbox mount, and the idea was the pilot, before bailing out, would hit, or while bailing out, should hit the explosives, which would break off the tail with everything in tow, so therefore the propeller and everything would go to the ground as the pilot came out with his 2 crew. So yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. We see a similar method on the Bearcat, where if you became unbalanced on one of the wings, you could blow off the outer tips of the wings with explosives. Same with the XB42. Now, obviously the second prototype didn't go so well, but the first prototype completed a ton of missions, over 150 in total, and at the end of its lifespan, we were getting to, the end of 1944, 45, and I believe in 45 or 46, they requested, can we strap some jet engines to this thing to see, if you want it, because at this point, it's still only a prototype, It's still only a machine which never has got into frontline service. So they're trying desperately to work out whether they can bring it in, and it seems like even after adding in the jet engine, still keeping the contraprop, still keeping all of the other features, it was still deemed, not to be main production worthy, or maybe because there was no requirement for it from the American Air Force, they just didn't need it. And a few other things to point in as well. When this thing was first initially designed, having the tripod wheels, as I call them, I know other people call them differently, but basically the front wheel on the front of the aircraft and the 2 in the center, instead of having one on the back of the aircraft, is not really revolutionary, but it's something that was not standard standard when it was being designed. So that's another nice little design feature that could be added, or should be added, sorry, if this machine comes in. Overall, I'd like to see this in the game. Has a bit of armament on it, has a good bomb load, has some interesting ideas, and maybe if you wanted to put it at a crazy high BR, you could always add the jet engines to under the wings, even though the version which had the jet engines under the wings, the first prototype version which did all of the flights, never had any armament on it when it came to primary. So that may be something to have a think about. And also, after testing, just once again, remember the ideas on paper don't always actually go to, the ideas on paper when they're actually tested, a lot of them change. So the ideas on paper were that they wanted a light machine here. They created a machine which was a lot heavier than they actually wanted. They even hollowed out the propeller to basically try and make it that little bit lighter. And also, they wanted a machine which would also not just be lighter but faster. And since it was heavier than anticipated, it was slower than anticipated. That doesn't mean that this machine wasn't fast, but it wasn't as fast as they wanted. So remember, this is a good lesson of you have this design over here, but when you test it, it could be completely different compared to what you have on the drawing board. So that's something to think about. The next one is, of course, a German machine, and where else could we go apart from Blohm Voss? So Blohm Voss, the Bv-141, if you don't know what this aircraft is, it is the aircraft which is probably the most well-known for Blohm Voss. It is the asymmetrical aircraft where it has the engine technically not really in the center of the aircraft, but you have the central fuselage, and then you have the wings on either side, and then you have the cockpit, which is not connected to the fuselage. It's actually by the side of the engine and everything else. And the reason why it was created like this is because, of course, who designed this? Well, if you watch my HA-140 video, you will know who designed this, a crazy man called Dr. Richard Vought, and he was the chief designer at Blohm Voss, obviously of HA before it became Blohm Voss, and he created this monstrosity, and it worked. It flew. There was at least, I believe, 28 examples of it, maybe a little bit less, 10 definite examples, and even though there was some issues with balancing of the aircraft, it still worked. It was still a revolutionary design in all of itself. One thing to think about, though, is this machine that you see before you. It was in competition with a few others to create a new reconnaissance aircraft for the Luftwaffe. But the issue that it had is that it didn't reach the training grounds in time, and therefore the Focke-Wulf 189, Uhu, the one we actually have in game, won kind of by default, and the Germans just decided, let's go with this one, even before they properly saw what the Bv-141 could do. On top of this, there was supposed to be an Arado design, but that kind of failed on the outset. So even though this design is really cool, the asymmetrical idea of it, generally, it was seen as a success, it still never really got off the ground as a proper design, especially when it came to the BV boys. So you got to take that into account. And also because it was supposed to be a reconnaissance aircraft, I can't find anything about an armament for this aircraft, but one thing that, if we can just find the right picture here, let's see. One thing that I do notice from these pictures, if we have a look at this one, is the fact that there seems to be some form of maybe, to me, it kind of looks like something set up to hold bombs, but then again, I might just be completely wrong on this, but there is ones on these side, and there is some under here, or at least near here, if you look at other pictures. Another thing to look at as well is there are estimates of what this thing should have, and it should have a general offensive armament which is very similar to the Focke-Wulf 189. So, a few 7.92s and that was it. So for me, I like this idea. I would love to see it in game. Somebody did make a user model ages ago for it, but unfortunately that no longer works in the game. And to be represented in War Thunder, I think would be wonderful, along with some of the more wacky designs, such as I believe it's the Ju-287, where one was made by the Soviets after the war, and then you had 2 examples for the Germans. This was the bomber with the front diagonal. Oh god, wings! That's the word I'm trying to think of. Yeah, the brain isn't exactly fully working today. But yeah, I think we should have it, even if we have to be a little bit relaxed on the armaments. A lot of these vehicles that I'm showing you have, let's just call it, relaxed armaments. Armaments which was never really fitted, but it was proposed. So for me, I think we can make that assumption that if it was going into frontline service, or maybe we can make the nose a little bit heavier, or maybe we can make the area a little bit heavier where the guns are supposed to be, or maybe we can worsen the performance a little bit, but I still think they should be added. They were tested, they were flown, especially stuff like the Douglas and some of the other ones that we're going to come up with. The next one is just an out-and-out fighter. For the Soviets, we've actually had a ton of weird and wonderful aircraft added to the Soviet tree, the I-29, the Tandem Mai, even stuff like the TB3 and the MBR2. So I thought, with all of these wacky and weird and wonderful things, why not go for something which is a little bit more practical, but still worse than its standard tech tree counterparts, and that's where the Yak-9D comes in. So the Yak-9D is a long-range escort fighter, and it was a version of the Yak-9 which was designed to go alongside bombers and be able to escort them to their targets and back again. The way that they did this is they increased the weight of this thing by adding fuel tanks everywhere for it, which obviously took a hit on performance. The general armament of it was 120mm and 112.7, very similar to the other Yaks that you see in the game, but I think this could be a nice addition to the game, just because we have tech tree equivalents, and on top of it, it wouldn't be, an event vehicle which was crazy good, but it would still be useful, especially if you took a minimum fuel. And on top of this, we don't just have the Yak-9D, you also got the Yak-9DD, which I think people could make some wonderful images out of. Here's another picture of the Yak-9D, and you can see it's very similar to the other Yak-9s that we have, and I think it would be lovely to see. It's very similar, with the cockpits being slightly different, and as I said, the fuel tanks being present all over the place, but overall it's basically the same. Now, it wouldn't be an event idea without mentioning the Boulton Defiant. Now, I've made a few videos on the Boulton Defiant, and there's good reason for it. I think it would be a lovely event vehicle in the game. Is it a pile of trash in-game? Yeah, it would be, but just like the Blohm Voss 141, I do believe it should take its place in War Thunder. The reason for this is because it was flown to good effect over France, and on top of this, it was a fully produced mainline fighter for the British, which eventually became a night fighter when the Germans realized what was going on. So, if you don't know about the Boulton Defiant, it was made around basically the early years of World War II. It was designed in the mid-1930s, and it was ready for operational use around about 1939, even maybe 1938, but mainly 1939 at the end of it. It was still being tested in the years of 1938 and 39. Now, it saw frontline service in the Battle of France, and what was shown was when they actually did some test dogfights with the Hurricane, which was the second tier fighter for the British at the time, because obviously we have the Spitfire coming out of the, reigns, pretty much dominating everything. It got absolutely canned by the Hurricane, and what was found was Defiant was not exactly great at what it was supposed to do, which was to be able to out-dogfight a fighter, get it in a position where you can then use the turret, which had 4 7.7s in it, to batter it, and then from there use its unconventional weaponry to take the enemy down and then go back to base. But the Hurricane was found to annihilate it. So instead, deception, I suppose, was used, where a lot of Me-109s or Bf-109s over France would think that they were diving on hurricanes or Hawker hurricanes, and instead what they would be opened up to would be a barrage of 7.7 fire, which would twat them out the sky. And I find this very, very interesting because it shows how in war, it isn't always just, you see a target, it looks very similar to something like a hurricane, therefore it is a hurricane. Sometimes it's a little bit different and it can throw a bit of a wrench in the works. We saw this a hell of a lot in battlefield reports when it came to either British pilots or American pilots, where they had said that they'd annihilated like whole columns, or let's just say they'd annihilated 20 tanks with their rockets, and then when a actual reconnaissance plane goes over the next day, you find out that you scratched the paint off a truck and that was it. On top of this, there was a lot of misreportings of tanks in World War II. I believe the Chieftain has talked about this and many others. The idea that every tank that you see is a Tiger, which is a bit of a problem when looking through historical documents. But the Boulton Defiant was one of those things that was mistaken for a Hurricane, so a lot of Bf-109s would set up on it, and, well, they would just open up and do well. And because of this, the Boulton Pole actually did pretty well. The only issue with it is once that deception or once that curtain has come over and the German pilots understand what they're looking at and work out how to tell the difference between a Defiant and a Hurricane, well, the Defiant's kind of screwed, isn't it? It doesn't have any frontal offensive armament. It has worse maneuverability and speed than a Hurricane, which was already something which was seen as not struggling against the Bf-109, but definitely not better than it, I think would be the best way of putting it. So the Defiant was dead in the water once it was finally figured out. And for me, I would love to see it in game because I think it's an interesting idea. Would it be useful? No. But just from a historical point of view, I think would be great to see. On top of this, it's also, after it was taken out of frontline service in 1940, it was used as a night fighter, which it actually once again struggled with because it was seen that it couldn't actually keep up with some of the bombers it was going after. Later on in the war, it was used as a reconnaissance aircraft and also a radar aircraft, so it did have at least a use going forward, but overall not really that useful apart from, that earlier spree of doing really well. The next one is obviously Japan, and this is another one which well, we've got to talk about the Oka. The Oka is not my pick, by the way, but if you don't know what the Oka is, the Yokosuka MXY7 Oka, this is a machine which was mass-produced by the Japanese, and it was designed as a suicide plane. It's kind of as simple as that. It was designed to fill it full of explosives and have one pilot who would guide the full machine into an enemy, and the enemy ship or the enemy airfield or the enemy whatever they were trying to hit at the time would go boom from, I believe it was 1,200 kilos worth of explosive. So this was a one-way mission. There was no back, there was just forward, and it was just a rocket-propelled bomb with a person steering it. So obviously the Japanese are well known in World War II for their suicidal attacks, and this definitely helped them with this. They caused quite a decent amount of damage with the Oka, but I don't understand how it would be represented in the game unless you could only bring it into like ground forces battles where you could go and ram somebody on the battlefield. My actual pick for the Japanese is the Aichi M6A float plane. Now, what is interesting about this is it was used by obviously the naval branch of the Japanese, and it was also used from 1944 to 1945. There was only 28 of them built, so not a ton of them, but it was a Japanese attack float plane which had a crew of 2 in it, and it was armed with 13mm Type 2 machine guns, so those aren't really that great, and on top of this, it could carry a torpedo or 1 or 2 bombs. The planes themselves were to be carried in a cylindrical hangar on the I-400 submarine aircraft carrier and launched by catapults. So just that story in itself, this is a submarine float plane, or a submarine catapulted float plane, which I personally think is really interesting, and the fact that it has a bit of bombs, has a bit of torpedo behind it, means that it would be useful in every game mode, and since there wasn't a ton of them built, I feel for me it should be an event vehicle, and since it really doesn't have that great armament, it shouldn't be too crazy, it shouldn't be that great anyway, and also with the fact that with the naval just come out, having more machines that can land and capture zones, for me, sounds like a great idea. The next one is this machine. So this is the SAI-Ambrosini SS.4 Canard Fighter prototype. Now this is an Italian plane, and what we find from it is it's one of the first which had the idea of having the engine and the propeller on the back of it. Now, obviously it wasn't the first, but it was one of the first which was properly built, and it was the Italian version of the Ascender and also the J7W, which comes near the end of the war. It also has a tricycle configuration that we talked about before, and obviously with that, it's pretty interesting as well. On top of this, the proposed armament, remember proposed, was one 30mm and two 20mm, so this thing was gonna pack one hell of a punch when it was supposed to actually hit something, and obviously with the design of having obviously the rudders in the middle of the wings, I just find this really interesting. The engine itself as well was the Isotta Fraschini ASSO 11 RC40 V12 liquid-cooled inline piston engine, which had 960 horsepower to it. Now, unfortunately, with this machine, you can actually see some interesting parts in the front here as well, which obviously helps you be able to maneuver the plane. It also has the air intake here, I believe. It could be. I might be wrong on that, though. The main issues that the Ambrosini SS4 ran into was the fact that the test pilot wanted to fly it a bit too much. What do I mean by this? So they had their first test flight. It went pretty well. It took off and it was able to stay in the air. And it was supposed to be shipped to somewhere else, but the test pilot actually convinced the people who were shipping it and also the management that instead of shipping it, he wanted to have one more go with it the next day. So the next day comes and he has a few issues. And what happens is basically the engine cuts out on him, and a lot of people attribute this to the fact that because of the way that the engine was set up and because of the fact it was a prototype and not fully, efficiently done up, especially with the casing of everything, that the engine vibrated itself so much that it dislodged itself along with some other stuff, and therefore that meant that he lost power in the engine. And what happened was, trying to land the machine, the Ambrosini SS4, the test pilot hit a tree. The engine comes from the back of the aircraft through the front, slamming the test pilot through the tree along with everything else. So basically created a human sandwich of tree, engine and pilot. So not the best, and a very sad actual end to a very interesting design. I wish we had more of these designs around in World War II, but there were some successful ones. They just never really made it mainstream. And why not have a weird and wonderful aircraft that could be from Italy? The next one is the NC600. So, the French. The French were an interesting bunch, always have been, always will be, and the NC600 is no different, mainly because of the struggle behind it. So, there's something that you have to understand about France, is in the 1930s, there was a party which was elected, mid-1930s, and it was called the Left Popular Front, and basically what they did, or what they wanted to do, was nationalize everything take away all the privatization, make it public or social owned, and the idea was to concentrate power so they could become more efficient. The problem with this idea is it doesn't work. And there are many reasons for this economically, but I'll just say, looking at history, I know there'll be a lot of people out there who disagree with this idea. I actually believe generally in a balance of things, have a little bit of government stuff going on, but then have people competing with the government for efficiency's sake on products. But in the mid-1930s, the socialist side of France took over and nationalized everything, and it went wrong. It went heavily wrong, and efficiency went through the gutter, and there was a lot of mismanagement, especially when it came to resources for stuff. So a lot of the projects, that you see, which, you'll see a lot of projects where it's like, well, they made kind of a cool design here. Why did they ask for like 2,000 of these things and only build 2? Or why did they decide to order 500 and only build 5? Like, it's because of this mismanagement, basically, and the fact that none of the areas were really wanting to talk to each other, and also with the fact that there was no proper competition involved. So anyway, past all of that, basically the NC600 came from a project from the mid-1930s where they wanted to create a modern aircraft which would be good as a light bomber. It would also be good in the attacker role, and it would also be good as an escort combat aircraft. Basically an escort fighter, reconnaissance, and also light bomber. Now, nowadays, or let's say mid-World War II or early World War II, a lot of people realized that it was hard to make an escort fighter, which was also a light bomber. But before then, the idea of having these combined features was one which was really strong with a lot of people. So with the NC600, that's what you saw. You saw a machine which was designed to escort some of the heavier bombers that they created, such as the Farman series that we see in game, and on top of this, it would also have some bomb racks, on it as well, so it could carry stuff alongside. The armament on the NC600, it was actually quite strong. But before we get into that, there was a aircraft which was called the H2201. This was the first prototype of this series, and it was built with two 450 horsepower engines, which are quite, quite low, to be honest. But after, that was created, the first flight took place in 1937, and then they pushed it into the H222, and then from there, in 1936, they decided to move the H222 and designate it the NC600. Now, this was all metal, it was short, sturdy, two-tail fin. As you can see on the back here, you can only see half of it, but you can understand, where it's going with the other fin on the other side. So you've got, quite a light aircraft. The engines aren't too powerful, so they upped the power on the engines as well. As you can see, 710 horsepower with the two-row radial 14-cylinder air-cooled engines, the Nomron M0/M1 Mars, and as I said, they developed a hell of a lot more horsepower. They added some pretty beefy fuel tanks, and it was seen as an alright machine, They test flew it worked well. The armaments that it had was two centrally mounted Hispano Suzas, the 20mm, and two 7.5mm. So it had bombs, it had access to good offensive front armaments. What it didn't have access to was the same thing that a lot of French aircraft didn't: production. And that meant that when everything was finalized, basically for this machine, in around about 1939-1940, well, guess what ended up happening? Somebody decided to invade France, and by that point, the NC600, even though a promising design in 1936-1937, was pretty much void, and also hardly any or none were produced. So even though it would be nice to see this in game, From a historical context, it didn't do too well, but from a game concept, I think it could do pretty nice. I generally like twin-engine fighters, even though they're not the most useful in the game. Is it the Piaggio 88, or I believe it's the Piaggio 88, the Italian one, but there's a lot of twin-engine aircraft which aren't great in the game. But I feel like for an event vehicle, the NC600 would be lovely to see, since we actually have, the vehicles which kind of beat it out, which were the Potezes. They were produced more than the NC600, and they were seen as the mainline machine which would do the NC600's job. So we already have in the main production tree the Potez, so the NC600 would fit perfectly as an event vehicle. So for me, those are the vehicles or the aircraft I would love to see as event vehicles going forward. There are many others I could talk about, but I would much prefer a lot of them to be main, main tree vehicles like the Whitley or the Skua, or anything like that. Or even the Buccaneer, wouldn't that be cool? But that is something to think about. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and next time we'll be having a look at the naval stuff. I'll see you next time.